I'm Margaret, a retired preacher's wife who spent most of my life trying to live by the good book, yet quietly fearing I'd fall short when it mattered most. I thought I knew what heaven held, what sin meant, and how faith worked until the day I died on that operating table. What I saw in those moments shattered everything I thought I understood about God, salvation, and the fragile thread that ties us to the ones we love. That brief step into eternity didn't just change my life. It gave me a mission I couldn't ignore, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of myself and my family. The operating room was colder than I expected. I'd been in hospitals before, sitting by my late husband's bedside for weeks as he battled cancer, but this time it was my turn to be the one laid bare under fluorescent lights. The nurses moved around me, efficient but kind, and the anesthesiologist made a joke I didn't quite catch as the drugs began to take hold. I closed my eyes, murmuring a prayer. Lord, guide their hands. If it's my time, take me gently. But if not, let me wake up whole. I didn't wake up, not at first. There was no gradual descent into unconsciousness, no peaceful drift. One moment I was there in the operating room, and the next I wasn't. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in what looked like a vast, gray expanse, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air felt heavy, thick with an eerie silence that pressed against my chest. There were shadows everywhere, shifting and curling like smoke, but they didn't feel empty. They felt alive, watching, waiting. I tried to speak, to cry out, but no sound came. That's when I saw it, far in the distance, a faint, golden light shimmering like a distant star. Instinctively, I began walking toward it, though every step felt like wading through molasses. The closer I got, the more I realized the light wasn't just light. It had a presence, a warmth that tugged at my soul. My heart ached with a yearning I couldn't name. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving me alone in the shadows. That's when I heard them, the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with every passing moment. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, murmuring words I couldn't make out. The sound was maddening, like a thousand secrets being told just out of reach. And then, one voice broke through the noise. It was clear, steady, and filled with an authority that silenced everything else. Margaret, it said, and I turned to see a figure stepping out of the darkness. I expected wings, a halo, maybe the shining face of an angel like the ones in the Bible stories I taught at Sunday school. But this figure wasn't what I imagined. It was tall, radiant, and cloaked in a light so intense I couldn't make out its features. Its voice was neither male nor female, but it resonated with a power that shook me to my core. Your time has not yet come, it said, and I felt relief wash over me. But before I could respond, the figure continued. You must return. There is work to be done. Work? I managed to ask, my voice trembling. What do you mean? What is this place? The figure didn't answer my question. Instead, it raised an arm, and the shadows around us seemed to part, revealing scenes that felt all too familiar. I saw my son, David, standing at the pulpit of his church, preaching with the fervor of a man possessed. But something was wrong. His words rang hollow, his eyes distant, and behind him, a shadow loomed, dark and menacing. Next, I saw my granddaughter, Emily, sitting alone in her bedroom, tears streaming down her face. She clutched a framed photograph to her chest, and though I couldn't see what it was, the pain etched into her features was undeniable. Around her, the shadows thickened, whispering lies that she seemed unable to escape. Finally, I saw my late husband, Paul. He was in a place much like the one I stood in now, but he wasn't alone. Shadows clung to him, their tendrils wrapping around his body, pulling him down as he struggled to break free. His face was contorted in agony, and he called out my name, his voice desperate. I turned back to the figure, my heart pounding. What is this? What's happening to them? These are the consequences of sin, the figure said, its voice heavy with sorrow. The choices they have made, the burdens they carry, and the truths they have not faced. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. but they're good people. David is a pastor. He's dedicated his life to serving you. And Emily, she's just a child. She doesn't deserve this. And Paul was a good man. He loved you. The figure's light dimmed slightly, as if sharing in my grief. No one is without sin, Margaret. Not even you. But redemption is still possible. That is why you must return. Their souls are at risk, and you are the key. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What can I do? I'm just an old woman. You are more than that, the figure said, stepping closer. You are their mother, their grandmother, their anchor. Your prayers, your love, and your faith can guide them. But you must act quickly. Time is short, and the darkness grows stronger with every passing day. Before I could respond, the shadows surged around me, pulling me back. The figure's light faded, and its voice echoed one last time. Do not lose faith, Margaret. Trust in the Lord, and He will guide you. The next thing I knew, I was gasping for air, the beeping of monitors and the frantic voices of doctors and nurses filling my ears. I was back in the hospital, alive, but forever changed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the visions replayed in my mind. David, Emily, Paul, their faces, their pain, and the ominous shadows that clung to them. I didn't know what it all meant or how I was supposed to help them, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. I had been sent back for a reason, and I would do everything in my power to fulfill it, no matter the cost. The first few days back at home felt like moving through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The doctors had called it a miracle, my heart restarting after they'd nearly given up on me. Family and friends came to visit, calling me blessed, telling me God wasn't ready for me yet. But the truth was, I didn't feel blessed. I felt burdened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David in the pulpit, his hollow eyes staring back at me. I saw Emily crying in that lonely bedroom. And worst of all, I saw Paul, wrapped in those terrible shadows, calling my name with a voice that still made my stomach twist. I prayed constantly, but the prayers felt different now, more urgent. Lord, what do I do? I asked him over and over, but no clear answer came. I opened my Bible, hoping the familiar words would bring me comfort, but instead, they seemed to leap off the page with a new intensity. Verses about sin and redemption seemed sharper, like they were written just for me. I found myself staring at the verse in James. Faith without works is dead. I had prayed for my family every day of my life, but now I wondered if I'd been too passive. Was prayer enough? The answer came quicker than I wanted. David called me one afternoon, his voice tight and polite, the way it always was when he was trying to hide something. Mom, how are you feeling? He asked, but I could hear the exhaustion underneath. David had always been a rock, strong, dependable, but something about him had shifted in recent years. He sounded worn down, like he was carrying a weight too heavy for him alone. I'm getting stronger, I told him, thanks to the Lord's mercy. He didn't respond to that. Instead, there was a long pause before he said, Emily's been struggling. She could use some of your wisdom. I closed my eyes, the vision of Emily sobbing flashing in my mind. What's wrong? I asked, my voice catching. She's just going through something, David said vaguely. Teenager stuff. You know how it is. But I didn't know. Emily wasn't just a teenager. She was my granddaughter, my sweet girl who used to crawl into my lap with a book and beg me to read to her. She had always been so full of light. What could have dimmed it? I'll come by, I said firmly. It's been too long since I've seen you, all anyway. David hesitated, and I knew he didn't want me to come. You don't need to push yourself, Mom. You're still recovering. I said I'll come, I repeated, and this time he didn't argue. The drive to David's house felt like traveling toward a storm. The air seemed heavier the closer I got, the sky darker, even though the weather report had called for sunshine. When I arrived, Emily was nowhere to be found. David was in his study, and his wife, Sandra, met me at the door with a strange smile. Emily's upstairs, Sandra said, but she didn't offer to take me to her. There was something distant about Sandra these days, a coldness that hadn't always been there. I wondered if she was part of the shadows I'd seen around David, or she was caught in her own. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs still weak from the surgery, and found Emily's door half open. She was sitting on her bed, earbuds in, staring blankly at her phone. When she saw me, she pulled the earbuds out and forced a smile. "Hey, Grandma," she said, but her voice was flat, lifeless. I sat beside her, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the slumped posture. "Emily," I said gently, "what's going on, sweetheart?" She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "Just school stuff. It's fine." It wasn't fine. I could see it all over her. The vision of her crying, clutching that photograph, was burned into my mind. "You can talk to me," I said. "You know that, right?" Her lip quivered, but she stayed silent. I reached for her hand, and for a moment, she let me hold it. Then she pulled away, muttering something about needing to finish homework. I wanted to push her, to demand answers, but I held back. If there was one thing I'd learned raising David, it was that pushing too hard could drive someone further away. That night, I stayed for dinner, though the atmosphere at the table was stifling. David was distracted, barely touching his food. Sandra kept glancing at him, her jaw tight, and Emily didn't say a word. I tried to make conversation, but every attempt fell flat. I felt like I was sitting with strangers, not family. As I drove home, the weight of it all pressed down on me. How had things gotten so bad without me noticing? I'd been so consumed with my own grief after Paul's death that I hadn't seen the cracks forming in my family. Now, those cracks felt like chasms. When I got home, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat in Paul's old chair, clutching his Bible to my chest, and prayed until my knees ached. I begged God to show me what to do, to give me the strength to help my family. But deep down, I felt the gnawing doubt. Could I really make a difference? I was just one woman, old and tired, with a family that seemed to be slipping away from me. That night, the dreams came again. I was back in the shadowy realm, but this time, I wasn't alone. Paul was there, his face twisted in pain, his voice desperate as he called my name. "Margaret," he said, "they're in danger. You have to save them." I woke up gasping, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew I couldn't sit back and wait any longer. The shadows were closing in, and my family needed me. Whether they wanted my help or not, I would find a way to bring them back to the light. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that wasn't from the surgery or the dreams. It was the weight of knowing I couldn't wait for things to change on their own. My family needed me, and I couldn't stand idly by. After a long prayer, I decided to start with David. If anyone would understand the urgency of what I'd seen, it should have been him. He was a pastor, after all. But as I replayed the vision of him at the pulpit, that shadow looming over him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I called his office at the church, expecting to hear his assistant's cheery voice, but instead, David answered directly. He sounded surprised and a little irritated, as if he were too busy for his own mother. "What's going on, Mom?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I'd like to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's important." He sighed, and I could picture him rubbing his temples like he always did when he was stressed. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. Can we talk later?" "David," I said firmly, "I'm coming to see you." There was a pause, and then he said, "Fine, but make it quick." He hung up before I could respond. The drive to his church was a quiet one, but my mind was loud. I kept replaying every sermon of his I'd ever heard, every conversation we'd had about faith. David had always been so certain, so grounded in his beliefs. But now I wondered if it had all been a facade. When I arrived, his assistant gave me a strained smile and waved me into his office. David sat behind his desk, papers spread out in front of him. But he wasn't looking at them. His eyes were on his phone, scrolling through something with a furrowed brow. When he saw me, he put the phone down and gestured to the chair across from him. "What's so urgent, Mom?" he asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. I sat down, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. "David, I need to talk to you about what happened during my surgery." His jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. Mom, we've been over this. You had a near death experience. It's not uncommon. It wasn't just an experience, I said, leaning forward. I saw things, David. Things I can't explain. I saw you. His eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But he quickly masked it with a laugh. You saw me? What does that even mean? I saw you preaching, I said, my voice trembling. But there was a shadow behind you, David. Something dark. It wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. David's expression darkened, and he stood abruptly, pacing the room. Mom, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. Every Sunday, I have to stand up there and deliver a message that people expect to change their lives. Do you know how hard that is? To feel like you're constantly failing. I know it's hard, I said softly, but you don't have to do it alone. Whatever burden you're carrying, you can give it to God. David shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. It's not that simple, Mom. People expect perfection. They don't want a pastor who's struggling. Then maybe they need to see that you're human, I said, standing up to face him. David, I saw something dark holding you back. If you don't confront it, it will destroy you. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes blazing. You don't know what you're talking about. Then tell me, I pleaded. Help me understand. For a moment, he looked like he might. His shoulders slumped, and he sat back down, his face in his hands. But when he finally spoke, his voice was hard. I don't have time for this, Mom. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Really? I knew he wasn't, but I also knew I couldn't force him to open up. I'll be praying for you, I said quietly, and he didn't respond. As I left the church, I felt a deep sadness settle over me. David was hurting, but he was too proud or too afraid to admit it. I didn't know how to reach him, but I couldn't give up. God had shown me those visions for a reason, and I had to trust that he would guide me. Later that evening, I decided to visit Emily again. If David wouldn't let me help him, maybe I could start with her. When I arrived, Sandra answered the door with a weary smile. She's in her room, she said, stepping aside to let me in. This time, I didn't hesitate. I knocked on Emily's door and walked in without waiting for an answer. She was sitting at her desk, her back to me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Emily, I said gently, I know you're going through something, and I know it's hard to talk about, but I want you to know that you're not alone. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders slump slightly. I don't know what you want me to say, Grandma. Say whatever's on your heart, I said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Even if it's messy, especially if it's messy. For a long moment, she was silent. Then she turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. I messed up, she said, her voice breaking. And I don't know how to fix it. I opened my arms, and she collapsed into them, sobbing. Whatever it is, I whispered, you can face it. God's grace is bigger than any mistake. As I held her, I felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't ready to share everything yet, but she'd taken the first step. And for now, that was enough. I would keep praying, keep pushing, and keep fighting for my family. Because the shadows might have been strong, but I knew the light was stronger. And I wasn't about to let the darkness win. The days that followed Emily's breakdown felt like stepping into a storm I couldn't outrun. She started opening up more, little by little, but what she shared shook me to my core. The photograph she had been clutching in the vision turned out to be of a boy, her boyfriend, or rather, the boy she had thought was her boyfriend. He had left her after she confided in him about her pregnancy and decision to have an abortion. She hadn't told anyone else, not even her parents. It was eating her alive, the shame, the loss, and the feeling that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. I listened to her pour her heart out, her tears soaking the shoulder of my blouse as she sobbed. I thought God wouldn't want anything to do with me anymore. I didn't even want to pray. Hearing her say that was like a dagger to my heart. This child, my granddaughter, was carrying this enormous weight all alone, and she believed she'd been cast out of God's grace. I held her tighter, rocking her gently like I had when she was small, whispering, "Oh, sweetheart, you're wrong. God's love isn't fragile. It doesn't break when we do. You can't push him away, no matter how far you think you've gone. But as I spoke those words to her, I felt a deep unease stirring in me. I wasn't just comforting Emily, I was speaking to myself. I realized I had been holding on to my own guilt, my own failures for years, things I'd buried deep, pretending they didn't matter. I had always tried to do the right thing, but there were moments when I fell short as a mother, as a wife, and as a believer. And now my family was fractured, and part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was my fault. Later that night, as I lay in bed, those thoughts spiraled out of control. Memories I'd locked away came rushing back. The times I'd scolded David too harshly, the years I spent so focused on Paul's illness that I neglected my children, the moments of pride and judgment that had hardened my heart. My prayers felt hollow, my faith like a house built on sand. I didn't know how to reconcile the person I had been with the person I needed to be now. And then the dreams came again. I was back in the shadowy realm, but this time it was darker, colder. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the whispers were louder, angrier, like a swarm of insects buzzing in my ears. I called out for the figure of light, but it didn't come. Instead, I saw Paul again, trapped in the distance, the shadows dragging him down. He was crying out, but his voice was faint, like he was drowning. I tried to run to him, but the shadows surged forward, blocking my path. This time, they weren't just smoke. They had form, shape. They became monstrous figures, grotesque and snarling, their eyes glowing with malice. They lunged at me, and I stumbled back, screaming. But before they could reach me, a blinding light erupted around me, and the shadows hissed, retreating into the darkness. The light coalesced into the figure I had seen before, radiant and overwhelming. Its voice rang out, commanding, "Do not fear, Margaret. You are not alone." I dropped to my knees, shaking. Why does this keep happening? I cried. Why do I keep seeing him like this? Why can't I save him? The figure's light dimmed slightly, and its voice softened. Paul's choices were his own. His burdens are not yours to carry. But he's suffering, I said, my voice breaking. And so is my family. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm failing them all over again. Your faith is your strength, the figure said. But faith is not the absence of fear or doubt. It is the act of trusting in the midst of them. You must forgive yourself, Margaret. Only then can you help others find their way. The light began to fade, and I reached out, desperate to hold on to it. Please don't leave me, I whispered. You are never alone, the voice said, echoing as the darkness closed in again. I woke up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The dream had been more vivid than ever, and the weight of its message was crushing. Forgive myself? How could I, when the mistakes of my past were etched into the lives of the people I loved most? But as I sat there, clutching my Bible, I realized that I didn't have a choice. If I didn't find a way to let go of the guilt that had chained me for so long, I would never be able to help Emily or David or anyone else. The next morning, I called Emily and asked her to meet me at the church. She seemed hesitant, but she agreed. When we arrived, the sanctuary was empty, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the pews. I took her hand and led her to the altar, kneeling beside her. Sometimes, I said softly, the only way to move forward is to lay everything down at his feet. All the guilt, the shame, the pain, everything you've been holding on to. You don't have to carry it alone. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with tears. But what if he doesn't forgive me? I squeezed her hand. He already has. You just need to forgive yourself. We prayed together, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was a start. As I walked Emily back to the car, I realized that helping her had helped me too. The act of guiding her to let go had reminded me that I needed to do the same. But the journey wasn't over. I still had to face David, to find a way to reach him before the shadows claimed him completely. And beyond him, there was still Paul, still trapped in that terrible place. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't do it alone. I would need every ounce of faith, every prayer, and every bit of strength I could muster to fight the darkness threatening my family. As I drove home, the sun dipping low on the horizon, I whispered a prayer into the quiet. Lord, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, but I'm trusting you to guide me. Show me the way, and I will follow. I woke the next morning feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The dream still lingered in the back of my mind, vivid and unnerving, but instead of fear, it left me with a quiet determination. The shadows were real, but so was the light. And if the figure in my dreams was right, that faith could be my strength, then I had to use it. It was time to confront David again, not as his mother, but as someone fighting for his soul. I decided to attend his Sunday service, hoping that seeing him in his element might give me a better understanding of what was weighing him down. I sat near the back, unnoticed, as the congregation filtered in. The sanctuary was beautiful, the kind of church Paul would have loved: polished wooden pews, stained glass that caught the morning sun, and a choir that sang with a richness that filled the space. Yet, despite the beauty, something felt hollow. When David stepped onto the stage, Bible in hand, he looked like a man going through the motions. His voice carried authority, his words eloquent as he preached about grace and forgiveness, but his eyes betrayed him. They were distant, tired, and void of the conviction I'd always admired in him. He was saying all the right things, but the fire that once fueled his sermons was gone. As I watched, I saw it again: the shadow, faint but unmistakable, looming behind him like a dark cloud. I couldn't wait any longer. After the service, I made my way to his office, determined to talk to him. He was sitting at his desk, flipping through notes, when I knocked and walked in without waiting for an invitation. Mom, he said, startled. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said, closing the door behind me. And this time you're going to listen. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. Is this about the shadow thing again? Because I don't have time for. This isn't just about the shadow, I interrupted. It's about you, David. I sat through your sermon today, and I saw it plain as day. You're struggling, and it's eating you alive. He rubbed his temples, a gesture I recognized all too well. Mom, I'm fine. I'm just tired. Running a church isn't exactly easy. It's more than that, I said, stepping closer. I've known you your whole life, and I can see the weight you're carrying. You don't have to do this alone. David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to dismiss me again. But then he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Do you have any idea what it's like to be the one everyone looks to for answers? To stand up there every week and feel like you're lying because you don't have it all figured out? You're not lying, I said softly. You're human. And part of being human is admitting when you need help. He shook his head. It's not that simple. People expect their pastor to be perfect. If I tell them I'm struggling, what happens to their faith? That's pride talking, I said, my voice firm but gentle. You're so worried about what people think of you that you've forgotten who you're really doing this for. David, God doesn't expect perfection. He expects faithfulness. And part of being faithful is trusting him enough to let go of the things you can't control. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability he'd been hiding. I don't know if I can do it, Mom. I've made mistakes, big ones. If people knew, they'd see you for who you really are, I said, sitting across from him. And that's okay. David, I've made mistakes too, more than I can count. But I've learned that God's grace isn't just for the people in the pews. It's for us too. You don't have to carry this alone. The tears finally spilled over, and he buried his face in his hands. I reached out, placing my hand on his shoulder, and we sat there in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. I've been having an affair, he confessed. It started after Emily's abortion. I was angry at Sandra for not telling me sooner, for keeping it from me. And instead of dealing with it, I ran. I found comfort in someone else, and now I don't know how to fix it. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice steady. That's the first step. Now you need to tell Sandra. I can't, he said, shaking his head. She'll leave me. She might, I admitted. But if you don't tell her, this will destroy both of you. The only way forward is through honesty, no matter how painful it is. David nodded, though his face was pale with fear. Will you pray with me? He asked, his voice trembling. Of course, I said. We bowed our heads, and I prayed for strength, for healing, and for God's guidance in the days to come. When we finished, David looked lighter, though the road ahead was still uncertain. As I left the church, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. That evening, I called Emily to check on her. She sounded better, her voice brighter than it had been in weeks. She told me she'd started journaling, writing letters to God as a way to process her feelings. It helps, she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. That's wonderful, sweetheart, I said. Just remember, you don't have to do it alone. I'm here, and so is God. After I hung up, I sat in Paul's old chair, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. The shadows hadn't disappeared, but they felt less oppressive, like the light was starting to break through. As I closed my eyes, I whispered a prayer of thanks, trusting that God would continue to guide me. But deep down, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Paul's face haunted my dreams, his cries for help echoing in my mind. Whatever was holding him in that shadowy realm, I had to find a way to reach him. For now, though, I let myself rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own challenges. And with God's grace, I would face them. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, a soft rhythm that somehow felt ominous. My dreams had been restless, filled with fragmented images of Paul and the shadowy realm. His voice, faint and pleading, still echoed in my mind. I sat up slowly, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders, and whispered the only prayer I could manage. Lord, give me strength. I don't know what's coming, but I trust you. The day passed quietly, though the weight of the dreams hung over me like a storm cloud. I busied myself with small chores, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. By evening, the rain had turned into a downpour, and the house felt unnaturally still. I sat in Paul's chair with his Bible in my lap, the familiar pages offering some comfort. As I read, my eyes fell on a passage in Isaiah. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. The words resonated deeply, and I clung to them as the heaviness in the room grew. It was as if the shadows from my dreams had seeped into the waking world. The air felt thick, oppressive, and a chill ran down my spine. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was back in the shadowy realm. This time, it was darker than ever before. The air was icy, and the whispers were louder, more chaotic, as if they were trying to drown out my thoughts. I stood on trembling legs, my heart pounding as I looked around. The light that had always guided me before was nowhere to be seen. Paul, I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. Where are you? There was no answer at first, just the cacophony of whispers. Then, faintly, I heard his voice. Margaret. It was weak, barely audible, but it was enough to guide me. I began walking, the ground beneath me shifting with each step. The shadows seemed to close in around me, their forms twisting and writhing, but I pressed on, clutching the Bible to my chest like a lifeline. Finally, I saw him. Paul was kneeling on the ground, his head bowed, the shadows wrapped around him like chains. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his hands trembled as he reached out toward me. Margaret, he said again, his voice breaking. I'm here, I said, rushing to his side. I knelt beside him, reaching out to touch him, but the shadows recoiled, hissing as if my presence burned them. You shouldn't have come, Paul said, his voice filled with despair. It's too late for me. It's never too late, I said firmly. God's grace is bigger than this place, bigger than anything you've done. We'll get through this together. Paul shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I failed you, Margaret. I failed our family. I made so many mistakes, and now I'm paying the price. I felt a surge of anger, not at him, but at the darkness that had convinced him he was beyond redemption. No, I said, my voice rising. You are not beyond saving. Jesus died for all of us, Paul, even for you. But you have to believe it. You have to let go of this guilt and trust him. The shadows hissed again, tightening their grip on him. I could feel their malice, their determination to keep him bound. But I wasn't going to let them win. I opened the Bible, my hands shaking, and began to read aloud. The words came haltingly at first, but then they flowed with a power that didn't feel like my own. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. As I read, the light began to return. It was faint at first, but it grew brighter with each word. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving as the light consumed them. Paul looked up, his eyes wide with wonder, and for the first time, I saw hope in his face. Margaret, he said, his voice trembling. I feel it. I feel him. Hold on to that, I said, gripping his hand tightly. Don't let go. The light enveloped us, and suddenly, we were no longer in the shadowy realm. We were standing in a place that felt impossibly vast, filled with warmth and peace. Paul's chains were gone, and his face was radiant, free of the pain and guilt that had weighed him down for so long. Is this heaven? He asked, his voice filled with awe. I don't know, I said honestly, but it's beautiful. A voice, gentle and familiar, spoke from behind us. You've done well, Margaret. I turned to see the radiant figure from my dreams. It was brighter than ever, its light filling every corner of the space. Is it over? I asked. Is Paul safe? The figure nodded. His soul is free, and so is yours. The burden you've carried is no longer yours to bear. You have shown great faith, and your family will be strengthened because of it. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at Paul. He smiled at me, his face filled with gratitude and love. Thank you, he said, for never giving up on me. Before I could respond, the light began to fade, and I felt myself being pulled back. I reached out for Paul, but he shook his head. It's not your time, he said. You have more to do. The next thing I knew, I was back in my living room, the rain still tapping against the window. The heaviness was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I didn't know how much of it had been real, but I knew in my heart that Paul was safe and that my family would be okay. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. I whispered a prayer of thanks, the words flowing easily. Thank you, Lord, for your mercy, your grace, and your endless love. I trust you to guide me, now and always. And with that, I rested, ready to face whatever came next.